Agenda is a matter of special privilege, and it's the 2022 Business Appreciation Award. And today we have Ms. Carpenter, the Virginia Regional Ballet. If you'll join me at the podium. Every year, the Williamsburg Development Authority Ms. Carpenter established this back in 2007, and with a co-founder, Heidi Robachek. So she trains professionally dancers, does different types of styles of dance, and even offers free lunches for people to come in who may not be able to afford to otherwise do that. That's a great thing, and through that is also some scholarships.
Correct.
So we want to just congratulate you on this award. We have a shiny little thing you can put on the shelf somewhere. I'm going to stand up here and just take a picture.
Okay.
Would you like to say a few words?
Say thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, so that takes us now to public hearings, the first of which, PCR 22-009, is an application of which I'm a party to, and so I will recuse myself from that conversation and pass the gavel on to the Vice Mayor to lead the discussion on that, and I'll go sit in the audience.
Thank you, Mayor. The first public hearing is PCR 22-009, request of Quarter Path Associates LP to amend section 21-483.1E 1C number to increase the number of units in an individual adaptive housing facility from 100 to 102.
Good afternoon. This is a request of Quarter Path Associates LP to change the number of units in an individual adaptive housing facility from 100 to 102 to allow for the conversion of a leasing office and co-op space in the existing adaptive housing facility at 620 York Street. The applicant's statement was included in the Council's agenda packet. The PDH district was established to encourage adaptive housing by allowing the conversion of a limited number of existing hotel-motel rooms located in the B2 zoning district into affordable housing for individuals and families, and thereby fulfilling a housing need not addressed in the city's existing housing inventory. The PDH district is located so to take advantage of the proximity to existing transit routes, pedestrian and bicycle facilities, and is not located on sites that have significant redevelopment potential. The proposal to change the number of adaptive housing units from 100 to 102 units at a single facility is in harmony with the statement of intent for the planned development housing district. The Planning Commission held a public hearing on May 18, 2022. Other than the applicant's representative, no one spoke at the public hearing. Planning Commission voted to recommend approval. Staff recommends approval of the text change to increase the number of housing units in individual adaptive housing facility from 100 to 102 as written in the proposed ordinance. I'm available if you have any questions, and the applicant representative are also present.
Thank you, Ms. Burke. Any questions from City Council before we open the public hearing?
Yeah, one question, and then for the applicant during the public hearing. So can you expand on your description of the planned development housing district? Do we have anything graphically that shows where it is? Is it an overlay district or what?
No, we have two properties in the city that have this zoning designation, and this property at 620 York Street, and then a more recently approved property on Parkway Drive. And it's a specific zoning request that those applicants have submitted.
So the district, the PDH district just has is actually at two locations right now.
Correct.
So when we say we're limiting it to no more than two, basically we're saying we have to have another text amendment if we want the next one to be added?
Correct. So when the ordinance was originally adopted, I think it capped the number of units at 100 units total in any scenario. That was later amended to add an additional 50 units. If I remember correctly, we're at about 140 or 141 units right now. The Planning Commission has started the conversation about amending the ordinance to allow for additional units to come into the program, but I think that there'll also be some additional amendments to the PDH zoning in itself. But there is an allowance in there for an additional 2 units. The ordinance just currently caps at any one location. You can't have more than 100 units, and so this would allow them to have 102. The applicant has indicated they just have some underutilized space on the property and would like to provide 2 more units.
Okay, thank you.
I have no questions for Ms. Burke.
Ms. Burke, only one question. When you talk about the conversion of the leasing and co-op space, it's my understanding that it is now a leasing and co-op space and it will be converted to 2 additional dwelling units.
Correct.
Is that correct? Okay, thank you. That was my only clarification question.
Yeah, and you answered my question about how many units were remaining and what was the reason for I didn't recall what the reason for the cap of 100, so that's the only question I had.
Okay.
No other questions? We'll open the public hearing. Anyone that wishes to speak to this matter, and the applicant and the applicant's representative is here. Welcome, Mr. Getty.
Yeah, Mr. Vice Mayor, members of council, I'm Vernon Getty. Pleasure to be here on behalf of the applicant. The Flats at Williamsburg has been a great success story under this ordinance. It stays virtually fully leased, and they had these 2 underutilized spaces, an old leasing office and a co-op space that, try as they might, nobody ever used. So it seemed a better use to convert them to adaptive housing units, and thus our request. We'd be glad to answer any questions, but would urge you to approve the application.
A couple questions. So I had a conversation this morning with Doug, which explained a lot of what's going on there, because I know the Planning Commission is really interested in this as a case study, being, a pilot and being so successful. But some of the questions that they have, and this is, and I know that information is being provided to the Planning Department to help the Planning Commission. One of the questions that the Planning Commission had a couple months ago was, what do we see before and after conversion in terms of demands on public safety resources, police and fire? What's the history been there?
I think this would probably be better able to answer that.
To the best of my knowledge, it is not necessarily a high call generating property now. I can't speak to prior to the conversion. I was not with the city at the time.
The other thing that was talked about was to what degree this is transition housing, and I think that the point that was made this morning was the transition phase typically is from moving out of maybe weekly hotel space into something that's more permanent and hopefully actually more affordable.
Right.
Which is a good thing. So,
And that's part of the conversation Planning Commission is currently having.
okay, thank you.
So the only question I had was, this was and currently is a leasing office.
Right.
So I assume the leasing office has moved to
Elsewhere.
another location? And will the management company that had been involved with the property remain the same?
Yes.
Thank you.
I have no questions. Thank you, Mr. Getty.
Thank you, Mr. Getty.
Thank you very much.
Anyone else wish to speak to this matter? Seeing no one, we'll close the public hearing and come back to council for additional questions.
Well, yeah, I support this successful project. It's been great to have it as a pilot.
And I agree, this was one of the recommendations from the Affordable Housing Committee to look at the conversion of additional motels, hotels into affordable housing, and this has been a constant need in the city and one of our GIOs that we're constantly trying to solve. So I support it as well. 2 more units is just another help.
And I'm in full agreement. I think there is a an idea, a proposal that has gone in front of planning around what it would look like to increase the cap of the units that can be converted, the cap which we are already at, but adding to is certainly nothing to decide against, and I look forward to seeing the proposal to increase the cap once we do.
Thank you. I agree. This is a success story, and I know that as Councilman Maslin pointed out, that the Planning Commission is looking at this success story and how we could even further convert some units that could benefit the city in this housing area. So no other questions, take a motion?
So I recommend that City Council approve the text change to increase the number of units in a individual adaptive housing facility from 100 to 102 as written in the proposed ordinance.
Second?
Mr. Rogers?
Aye.
Ms. Ramsey?
Aye.
Vice Mayor Dent?
Aye.
Mr. Maslin?
Aye.
Oh, sure. Didn't realize we had the only ones.
All right, so thank you. That takes us now to the second public hearing, which is a proposed purchase of 180 Strawberry Plains Road by Kale Development LLC.
So I guess I'm going to handle this one. Kale Development LLC has made an offer to purchase 13.9 acres at 180 Strawberry Plains Road, which is owned by the city of Williamsburg, for $650,000 plus 15 affordable housing units. So I'm going to outline the terms of the purchase agreement and the restrictive covenants that go along with it. The developer is proposing to build 116 townhomes, and of that, 15 will be what are considered workforce housing units, which will be sold for $100,000 less than the other units, with the approximate sale price of the units being $325,000. The developer has to apply for rezoning within 60 days of the contract execution, has to cooperate with the city, and the city cooperates with the developer on the development plan. The restrictive covenants for the workforce housing are to be recorded at the same time as the development plan. The contract calls for supplemental restrictive covenants to provide for the rules related to the workforce housing. The contract provides for closing within 45 days of all of the conditions being met, which is the rezoning and title examination and property examination. It allows the developer to buy out the city's interest if the workforce housing units have not sold and a certificate of occupancy has been issued for the last unit constructed. And that buyout amount is $100,000 per workforce housing unit that's not sold at that time. The market and workforce housing units have to be constructed to the same standard and quality, and the workforce housing units will be across the development, not located in one specific part of the development. Construction has to commence within 2 years after closing. A 6-month extension can be granted by the city manager. That's measured by, and commencing construction is measured by the date that the developer obtains the first building permit on the first unit. The city has the right to repurchase for $650,000 if construction has not commenced by that deadline. So Exhibit A to this agreement are restrictive covenants that we've drafted. The Housing Authority will administer the restrictions for the workforce housing unit. The workforce restrictions are in addition to any other restrictions that the developer puts on the subdivision and will control in the event of a conflict. The workforce housing units can only be sold to qualified persons, that is a person or family with a household income of between $40,000 and $60,000. That number gets adjusted for inflation. And that individual must also work at least 30 hours per week in the city, James City County, or in the Bruton District of York County. The Housing Authority has to qualify buyers before they can purchase. It allows the Housing Authority to purchase one or more of the workforce units at the workforce housing price. Requires owner occupancy of the workforce units. The qualified buyer cannot own another home, cannot use the property as a rental property or as a short-term rental. It allows the buyer to provide for capital improvements, but the Housing Authority can require pre-qualification of those capital improvements to limit what counts for purposes of equity in the property in future. So we do have to create that working document. It sets a maximum resale price, which equals the annual increase for inflation plus a credit for any capital improvements that were qualified. It allows the Housing Authority to purchase a unit if the covenants are breached. It also allows the Housing Authority to force the sale of a unit in the event of breach. It prohibits liens from qualified mortgages or any lien except by qualified mortgages as defined by the restriction, and it limits the amount that can be borrowed on the unit to 95% of the purchase price. And the restrictions run with the land and they last for 40 years. So the hope is that this will perpetuate an ongoing supply in this development of workforce housing units. All right, so that was a lot. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. The developer and the developer's attorney are also here.
Questions for the attorney?
Thank you, Ms. Shelton. I know it was a arduous task to put all of these guidelines in place, but obviously I think it's a step in the right direction for inclusionary housing and all the requirements that you put in there to make sure that those units remain workforce housing. So, and at this time, I don't have any questions.
I'll wait to hear from the applicant.
I have no questions at this time.
I have one for the applicant as well. Oh, wait, thank you.
Mr. Trivett, can you talk a little bit about how the value of the land was established and correlation to the price that they're actually selling it or purchasing it for, and where the $100,000 discount on essentially on the price of the units came from?
Certainly. This property has been owned by the city for some time, and because of that, the assessed value was artificially low in the records. We don't spend a lot of time assessing property that the city owns. We don't do it on the same recurring schedule. So when we were approached about a possible purchase offer, I asked the assessor to go back and look at it and revalue it as if it were privately owned so that we would know what the acceptable price would be. And the price that he decided after comparing all of the similar types of properties in the area that had recently sold was within $100,000 of the price that we were offered by the Kales. But in our conversation with the Kales about their interest for purchasing it to build residential, we talked a lot about the fact that the council has established one of its goals to create and increase affordable housing opportunities inside the city, believing that housing is important to the community. And so we did ask them to consider an affordable housing component. Over the next few months, I worked with the Kales on what that might look like, going back to the affordable housing work group's report that identified where the needs were in terms of the affordable housing strata from low income, ultra low income to high income, as well as the different opportunities that the committee recommended for increasing housing. And we landed on a voluntary inclusionary option for this property. And that's what's before you today. We're pretty proud of it because it's one of the first ones, well, it is the first one for the city of Williamsburg. It may be one of the first ones in the region to use a restrictive covenant to make sure that the properties stay affordable for the lifetime of the property. But also, I think it's a unique opportunity in that the affordable units will be indistinguishable from all the rest in the development. And so this is a real rare opportunity to have 15 affordable units in a development that is mixed income as well as mixed unit types.
Thank you. All right, if there's no other questions, we'll open the public hearing and invite the applicant to come up first and share a few words if they wish.
Good afternoon, guys. Mr. Mayor, Mr. Vice Mayor, members of council, thanks for having me. I'm John Kale with Kale Development. I want to just start, I'll be brief in my remarks, but we're super excited about this project. It's kind of been a long time coming, working with the city and to get going. And Ms. Shelton did a great job pointing out the 15 units, but also I wanted to make note publicly that it's 116 units, 101 units also meet a demand that was established by the Affordable Housing Group recently in the moderate income bracket. So the entire project fulfills a demand that was established there. So we're excited to get going, and also this is, in all our years of doing this, this is probably one of the most creative site plans and best use of land I think we've done. And my dad said that numerous times. He's been doing this for 40 some years. So that being said, I know some people had questions about the unit mix and the breakdown of units, so I was just going to, a few bullet points about that, then I'd be happy to take any questions. 116 total units, 13% are workforce. All units are two-story townhome style. 96 of the units are 1,440 square feet, 2 or 3 bedrooms options. They will also have options of first-floor bedrooms and detached garages available throughout the site. 20 units will be a little larger, 1,800 to 2,000 square feet, 3 or 4 bedroom options, and all those units will have first-floor bedrooms and garage included. One thing we've learned from being in this market in a while and doing development, whether it's been Holly Hills, Landfall, Newtown, this market likes first-floor masters and garages. And another thing that speaks to the creativity of this site, we were able to achieve that with these townhomes. So we're excited to show more as we get further down the process, hopefully. The development is laid out in blocks, and each block will have a landmark gathering area at the center of the block that complements the building elevations. The amenities include pickleball, pool, pedestrian pass, and neighborhood landmark gathering areas. And as we know from the Affordable Housing Work Group, less than 10% of those who work in the city live in the city. And once we get going with this, our goal is out the gate to work with the city to target those folks directly who work and are unable to live in the city. So whether it be firefighters, police officers, teachers, professors, childcare workers, et cetera, we want to offer housing to these folks so they'll be able to call Williamsburg home also. So with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thanks. Questions for the applicant?
Yeah, just one, thank you, Mr. Kale. At what point in the process would you or will you make contact with adjacent property owners if everything's approved and as you begin the development?
Yeah, we just handle it like a typical purchase for us. Once we get under contract, then I would probably reach out to the HOA like we typically do and get in front of them and start showing them plans and give them on board. And one thing, I'll say publicly that we're going to offer to the adjacent neighborhood is access to our amenities. So yeah, once the contract process gets going and we get into the rezoning process. Yes, sir.
Thank you.
A couple questions. One of the challenges in terms of putting together a project like this in the details, and we've seen it on the governor's end, is it's really three-dimensional because we've got these different timelines. So when you're putting a pro forma together, the first milestone is really the purchase of the property, but at that point you're also projecting what the market rate of the unit's going to be, which we know when they're actually built that will be a different price because there'll be some escalations. And one of the advantages of the way this is structured is using inflation rates to escalate. So the relative relationship should stay the same. I think one of the good things about what we've heard is you really have two different size footprints, and then they can be configured by a number of different bedrooms. But if we were looking at that $325,000 market price today, is that for the 1,440 square foot footprint or the 1,800 square foot?
That would be for probably more of the 1,400 square foot.
1,400.
Yeah.
So there will be more expensive ones, but they still would benefit, if they're within the 15, they would benefit from the $100,000
Yes,
subsidy.
We're let the market choose which units they prefer.
The other thing that I think you've mentioned before is you'll have two lenders that are very familiar with the project, and that will help prospective buyers, especially new home buyers, pre-qualify and come up to speed quicker rather than them going to someone who doesn't know anything about this project and they have to come up to speed with it quickly. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, good question. Throughout this process, as you know, we've done a lot of due diligence, and we would have two preferred lenders and, standard offer closing incentives with those lenders. But one good thing about having those preferred lenders is that they're aware of this process and educated on the affordable aspect of things and the deed restrictions. And I know our attorney, Lindsay Carney, she's spoken to one of those lenders in detail, and we've already started how to structure that. So I think that just helps smooth the financing process along. I mean, obviously anyone can bring their own lender to the table, but to use one of our preferred ones that are well-informed and educated on the deal would make it easier on whoever's purchasing the home.
Thank you.
John, thank you for being here and for presenting this opportunity to the city. So just a couple things. So of the 2 units you mentioned, they were different configurations, 3, 4 bedrooms, 2, 3. So sort of at what process would a prospective buyer be able to make that determination?
Yeah, good question. We're going to do the job in phases, 3 phases as we just initially see right now. So I think there's 20 of the bigger units and 96 of the other ones. So the vast majority are the smaller units. But so I imagine we would just, the way the site lays out, we would divide that 20 by 3 and just put in 3 different phases. So.
And if all goes according to plan, as far as the different timelines that Mr. Maslin mentioned, when do you hope to have the first units ready for occupancy?
I don't know, certainly within a 2-year window, but our goal is, once we get everything entitled and go through the process, would be to start site work early next spring.
Okay.
So that, and it's as you know, with the site plan approval and rezoning, that takes up some time and tweaking that stuff. But we'd like to get all that done by this year and then get through the rainy months of January and February for the site work, and then hit the ground running in the spring.
Thank you.
Mr. Keel, thank you for the presentation. It's been mentioned, but this is such a unique thing that we have in front of us. I know it was a rarity to have a restrictive covenant like the one that has been created for this development. So I really appreciate, as a first thing to say, Kale Development for being a bit unique in considering this. I know it's new for you all. It's pretty new for us. So we're excited to partner in this with you. I have 2 questions. The first is on, you mentioned that you all would, when the time comes, work with the city on trying to identify people who work here to reach out to see if they would be interested in applying for a place to live and buying one of the restricted units. How might you go about the marketing effort to people to make sure they understand this option near where they work is also a place where they could live?
Well, I think we have a good resource just with city employees and William and Mary professors and that aspect of things. When we started building the Holly Hills townhomes, we had a grand opening, and we had members from the police community at Williamsburg and some firefighters come, and it was just a little bit of a higher price point than what, and that's kind of what planted the seed. Was like, man, I wish you guys would do something like this in the city limits. So that would be our first aspect, and we've talked with the city manager about how we can approach that and market to those folks.
That's great. Yeah, I'm sure a lot that came to the Holly Hills Townhome opening, if there was any information collected, would be interested in this as well. My second was, you mentioned to Councilman Ramsey's question, potential 2 years to occupancy, next spring, starting to do site work. I know that the effort around talking about this development would come earlier than that, though. So from today in June, if you can ballpark it, how long do you think it would be before the marketing about the actual units and the development as in its entirety would go live for people to apply or reserve a unit for the years to come?
If we started site work in the spring, then late summer.
Okay.
We'd be marketing the units. And if everything, we're going to start if everything goes quicker than that. We'd like to start sooner than later, but I guess being a developer, I'm a little skeptical on the time frame sometimes, so that's why I say the spring.
Well, that makes sense. It's hard to be a developer
Yeah.
today, too. So that late summer of 2023.
Yeah.
That is right. You have some pictures.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thank you for the information. That's all from me.
Thank you, Mr. Kale. If there's no other questions, we'll move on with the public hearing.
Okay, thank you.
Good, thank you. Would anybody else like to come forward and address council on this issue? Seeing none, I'll close the public hearing and come back to council for further discussion.
Just a couple comments, as Councilman Rogers stated. This is a unique opportunity for Williamsburg, not just because it's a GIO that was established by this council, but we know there's a need there. And Mr. Kale pointed out something I think needs to be mentioned again, that it doesn't get lost in this. We're excited about the workforce housing opportunity, but it also provides 101 units in that middle income area. It's something that I wanted to say that related to this, and I had the opportunity to attend a panel discussion hosted by the Williamsburg Health Foundation today, parenting in poverty, and listen to a lot of different stories of families that were connected with the care team in the city of Williamsburg and James City County. And at one point during all of their discussions, the moderator asked them if there was one thing, tomorrow morning, if you woke up, if there was one thing that could change your life, what would it be? And every family said stable housing, because you listen to them talk about the fear of they don't know where they're going to be next month, or one family who gets $800 in disability and their rent is $850 a month. So they said that would be the one thing that would make a huge impact on their lives. And then the one statement that stuck with us, and Wendy and I discussed it afterwards, is one of the families said, housing is health care. So that was something that was, I think, resonated with everybody in the audience there. And I think this is a perfect opportunity to hopefully provide some of that housing as health care.
No, I agree, and I think we've heard from the Affordable Housing Task Force that we're short of housing across the full spectrum, everything from the public housing to workforce housing to housing for entry-level housing for young professionals and young families, and I think this is a good way to hit some of those areas. Also, I think that we know that one of the best ways for us to be successful in these housing projects is if we're a partner. And so the fact that we own the land and we can actually contribute to the pro forma through the subsidy up front that then carries over to the eventual buyers, I think is a great way that we can actually do that, and hopefully will be an example for other jurisdictions to follow. Thank you.
And I would agree with everything that's been said. I think this is a win-win opportunity, a great use for the city to sell some land that's been sitting there and address one thing that we've heard continuously is the need for housing in different categories. And I also think that it's great that we have a local firm of family that's been invested in the city, involved in the community, and is demonstrating a creative solution to a need that we have, and perhaps developing a model that can be used for other projects down the road. And not only a model that we can follow, but a model for Ms. Shelton and all the work that she did, so when another one of these comes along, hopefully you won't have to create the wheel the next time. So I fully support this.
I very much agree. This is a really great day for the city. 2 years ago, we would have convened around the GIOs, and affordable housing has been one longer than that shorter time frame. It's probably rare where we have 2 different chances in one city council meeting to provide more affordable housing and at different levels on the income scale. And Councilman Ramsey and I served on the Affordable Housing Work Group, and one of the main recommendations was to provide more housing on that entire scale rather than just for one group or another. So very excited for this development. I appreciate the innovation from city staff and the creativity of Kale Development on this issue.
Well, and I agree with everything that's been said. I think moreover, this opportunity to participate in inclusionary zoning is something that we've talked about for years, ever since back when I was on Planning Commission, and I know our former Mayor Paul Freiling would be really excited because it's something that he had championed for a long time. And this is a way for the city, as Mr. Maslin pointed out, to participate in providing housing by offsetting the cost of the purchase price, because we know that affordable housing just doesn't happen. You know, developers aren't going to show up and build it because there's no real ROI on that. And so the money's got to come from somewhere, and this is our opportunity to participate in creating these units that will hopefully end up with people that work in our community, as Mr. Kale pointed out. The fireman, the policeman, the teacher, the nurse, because they are deserved of good quality housing. And I think working with a local developer, I know Mr. Kale is going to be on top of this project because, this is his reputation, and he's going to do a real good job at this. And so I applaud you for your efforts on this, and Ms. Shelton, thank you for all the work in creating this covenants that will protect housing stock so that it doesn't fall off into investors' hand. And I think that's an important aspect of this as well. So thank you. Is there a motion?
So I move that City Council authorize the city manager to execute the real estate purchase agreement for the sale of 13.9 acres located at 180 Strawberry Plains Road to Kale Development, LLC.
Second.
Mr. Rogers?
Aye.
Ms. Ramsey?
Aye.
Mayor Pons?
Aye.
Vice Mayor Dent?
Aye.
Mr. Maslin?
Aye.
So that takes us now to reports, and the first is the monthly financial statement. Ms. Dameron?
Good afternoon. I'd like to note that for the first time in a long time, we won't have a COVID recovery report. And I do want to start by saying that there's still some uncertainty out there. I think you'll find this to be overall a positive report, but I would tend to call it cautiously optimistic. We can clearly see where we were pre-COVID. We can look back and see where we were during COVID, and as we come out of some of the more restrictive environment that we had. I think I start to see a new cash flow trend emerging, but we haven't had enough time for that to really develop good forecasting. So I think you'll find me speaking in terms of where I expect to end the year more in ranges. And I think you'll see what I mean as I make a few comments. In terms of our real estate, well, let me back up a minute. We had about 5 major categories of revenues that we were tracking on our report. And so looking at just those, in terms of real estate, at the end of May, we were at 73% of budget. Now, typically, I find that range at the end of May to be more low 80s, maybe even high 80s into the low 90s. So that caused me a little concern. I did look at that, and as of yesterday, we are at 87%. But with that said, I'd really, to have a good comfort level, need about 1.7 million to come in between now. And actually, for revenues that were intended in this budget, we can accrue them if we get them within the 60 days at year end. So we'll be picking those up and accruing them till the end of August. Personal property, however, is, before I move off of real estate, let me just say I'm still estimating that we have a good chance of making budget, because it's not uncommon for us to have that happen where we continue to pick up even after June 30th. Personal property tax at the end of May was at 99% of budget. And I'm anticipating that we will make budget on that. Our business, professional and occupational license has exceeded our budget by $425,000. Lodging tax has exceeded or at least I estimate that we're going to exceed budget by $1,250,000. Right now, we have exceeded our budget by about 21%. Our lodging tax has exceeded the budget at 27%, and so I think that's coming in. And I'm sorry, let me correct myself. On B poll, I think 425. The lodging is 1,250,000. Correction there. I apologize for that. Saw the wrong column. Our meals tax is at 90% of budget, and I am estimating that we will exceed our budget by about 700,000. So those 5 revenues, I'm looking at exceeding the budget by about 2,375,000. If you will recall, we had estimated that we were going to draw from our reserves about 2,500,000. Just to mention a few other revenues, our recordation revenue exceeds the budget now by $155,000. Our emergency medical service revenues at 98% of budget, so I'm pretty confident we're going to make budget there. And our permits and license have exceeded by 87,000. While we haven't received our payment in lieu of taxes, we are anticipating that they will come in and meet budget during this month. There are a few revenues that I believe are going to come in under budget. One of them, bank stock taxes, shouldn't be any surprise there with the history that we've had. That's starting to change, but I'm thinking that's going to be about 180,000 under budget. And communication taxes, I'm thinking, will be under budget about 60 to 70,000. Now, there are a few other revenue variances that are much smaller, both positive and negative. In terms of our expenditures, currently we're in line with budget. Our expenditures right now about 70% of budget. We do have some transfers that I know we'll be making. We typically do those either twice a year or quarterly, and taking those into account, that would bring us into 88% of budget. As of May, we have drawn $2,868,000 from our reserves. Now, that's a cash flow. We typically do expect that until we have that real estate collection in June pick up. And while I don't think that we are going to draw anywhere near $2.5 million from our reserves, we're still at risk at drawing some. I would think in the hundreds of thousands, I think possibly 300. But we also stand a good chance of not having to draw any, or maybe add a little bit. In terms of our sales tax, we are currently at 82% of budget. I am anticipating that we will exceed our budget at year end by about 450,000. Our tourism sales tax is at 82% of budget, and I'm thinking by year end we could maybe look at 350,000 over budget. Our $2 lodging tax is a little bit over budget by about 6%. I am thinking that we will exceed the budget by about 220,000. And at this point, I would say that everything except that $2 lodging tax has now exceeded where we were in May of FY19. And then lastly, just a few comments on the utility fund. Our revenues there are at 84% of budget. Having said that, our availability fees have exceeded the budget by $515,000, so that's definitely a help with our utility budget. Expenditures are at 68% of budget. Our adopted budget anticipated drawing $1,300,000 from our reserves. We did do an additional appropriation to purchase land for water protection. I do think even with that additional appropriation that we will not be drawing the 1.3 million. I think we will be drawing a smaller amount, maybe $500,000 or so at this point. Now that could change because all of this depends on our trends continuing. But we still continue to see that consumption increase as things open up in water and sewer both, most of it related to commercial. So overall, I think that's a positive report. We're on the right trends. But there's still a little bit of uncertainty in terms of how we're going to end the year. Certainly better than what we had budgeted, but with some of the inflation and other factors that we're experiencing impacting some of the cash flow, it may come in a little bit slower. Be glad to answer any questions you might have.
Mr. Vice Mayor?
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Dameron. Towards the end of your presentation, you answered one of the questions I had was where you thought we would be as far as the draw and the reserve, what your projection would be. So certainly you don't feel like it's going to be at the 2.5 million that was projected. And then you kind of touched on the other question was have you seen a significant impact on the operational budget with fuel and other inflation costs?
Yes, we have, and of course, we need to stay within our budget. So certainly what we're seeing, our costs are increasing, both in terms of fuel and supplies that we utilize. And another thing, I mentioned how we accrue revenues, and we do the same thing with expenditures. Any expenditures that we receive, and typically we keep that open for the same 60-day period for any services or product that we received as of June 30th. And that 60-day holds unless something came in later that was material, and then we'd have to open the books back up if it happened before our audit. But yeah, it's a tough expenditure budget. Now, we did have some vacancies, and of course, with some of those, when we did the increase in police salaries, we're counting on the vacancies for that, so that cuts into some of it. But we had vacancies in other areas that will help mitigate some of that cost, but I'm not expecting to see as much. And we've seen that trend line where we're not having as large of coming in under budget in as large of amounts.
Thank you.
Just one question on the shortfall on real estate tax collections, which were due June 1.
Right.
So I know whenever I go by the finance window, I see a box full of envelopes with your short staff of 3 people trying to post. How many envelopes do you have there that haven't been posted that could be contributing?
Well, I know, and I just came in late, like 2 o'clock in the morning from a conference, so I hadn't had a lot of time to see where we're at now. But typically, they may run a couple of weeks behind. And in terms of short staff, we've certainly, we went for a long time not being able, like in our utility, we weren't doing cutoffs, and now we've started sending out those notices. So call volume has definitely picked up, and we certainly anticipate that during tax collection too, and also when we're selling parking decals, there's a higher volume. We will continue to monitor that moving forward to see if we need to make some considerations in terms of staffing.
Thank you.
I don't have any additional questions from what has already been asked. Thank you.
And neither do I guess only as a comment, the $2 lodging tax, as you said, at least right now, being a little bit 6% over what was budgeted is an encouraging sign. As in the COVID-19 report, we began to see some of that tax more based around tourism go up, get in the black, but that one was always lagging. So I'm glad to have heard that.
That one tends to be, and I meant to mention that in terms of our lodging, within the recent, past 4 years, let's say, because certainly that used to be much higher than even in the past 4 years. But looking at the past 4 years, I think our highest year was 2018. It was $3,360,000, and I'm anticipating we may land about 90,000 more than that. If the trend I'm seeing now continues. They say, a lot of the economists, that this higher gas isn't going to impact travel, especially closer travel. I hope they're right, but we'll keep watching that and see.
Isn't that the truth? Well, no questions for me. Thank you.
And I think historically, while gas prices are a burden on folks, Williamsburg is, in terms of visitation, has been somewhat insulated from those higher prices because of the proximity and drive. It really more affects where people fly. Hopefully, we're right again this year and that won't impact us too badly. But that said, it's a cautionary tale as you started off. We don't know what the future holds, and there's still some uncertainties out there that we should just be aware of.
Right.
Thank you, Ms. Dameron. Okay, monthly departmental operating reports.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. So what we thought we'd do today is ask Wendy Evans to come up and give a very brief presentation on a grant that we received some time ago and how we've used that funding. I recently gave a similar presentation to the Virginia First Cities organization, who lobbied the state successfully to create the funding that the grant is drawing from. And it was highlighted as a best practice in the state.
Thank you. Good afternoon. And like Mr. Turvitt said, he had to give this presentation, so now I have the challenge of matching it. And thank you, Vice Mayor, for mentioning that panel this morning. Those voices were very powerful, and so I'm so happy you could be there this morning to hear that. So I will talk a little bit about our Pathways to Independence program. So we receive a grant through the Department of Social Services for this program, and it serves residents of the city, James City County, York, and Poquoson. And we developed this years ago in collaboration with Virginia Career Works as well as Thomas Nelson Community College. And so the services are targeted to clients receiving the temporary assistance for needy families benefits and also individuals that are lower income. And it's focused on assessing and increasing those employment skills, but also addressing the barriers to employment. And so we blend these grant funds with some local funds to support 1.5 positions. So we have a part-time job developer on staff who help individuals with resumes and teaches the course, which I'll mention in a minute, as well as a full-time life coach to help individuals with the barriers they're facing to employment, to obtain employment or to retain that employment. So the innovative approach really to our program, which makes us stand out, is the combination of the classroom and the life coaching services. And so we know that our community relies on the service industry, tourism, and the customer skills that are needed for those positions. We also can all probably recognize that it takes customer service skills or interpersonal skills to maintain a job with your colleagues and your supervisor. So we've developed this training course to provide those training skills, those job skills, and then we have that one-on-one life coach to help individuals. So we've been doing this for a few years, but obviously when COVID hit, we had to adjust and adapt because we couldn't have course or a class at Thomas Nelson because of course they closed the campus, and we couldn't be in the homes providing these coaching. So we created a virtual job readiness academy. So we took components from our class, which I'll talk about in a minute, and we put them online. So now it's an hour and a half for 1 week versus the full class. So we've adjusted, but now we're adjusting back and doing a combination of both virtual and in person. So it's really improved, I think, our ability to get the word out. So the first component of our program is this Customer Service Academy, and it's an 80-hour training course that we developed, our staff developed years ago, and these are the modules of the course. I won't read them, obviously. And so we developed the curriculum, and Thomas Nelson has accredited or approved the curriculum, so participants receive 8 credits for participating. So after they go through the month-long course, they come out with, master application, all their documents needed, all those job tools, and college credit on their resume, which makes them more employable. So right now we're holding the class at the Thomas Nelson Thomas Nelson site here in Williamsburg, and so it's on the same campus, same building as the One Stop for the Career One Stop, so we make those connections if needed. So we help them get those job tools, and then towards the end of the month of this academy, the staff bring the participants shopping to get the clothes for an interview. They videotape a mock interview, and so graduates are, come out of that class typically with a job offer already, and then all the tools they need. And then the goal is to then move on to the second component, which is the life coaching. So what we saw in the past was they got to the end of the class and they got employed, and then life happened, and then they were unable to maintain that employment. So like I said, we have a full-time life coach. And so this really makes us stand out. And like, we heard this morning, and like many of you were at the Only Us documentary on Monday, it's just not as easy as get a job, right? There's so many barriers, criminal background, if you have disabilities of your own or your children have disabilities, transportation, childcare, all those things impact your ability to maintain your employment. So the life coach really works on addressing those individual barriers, and has a service plan with someone, sets goals, and tries to problem solve and work the systems in order to maintain that employment. The life coach is also there because a lot of our benefit programs require certain job search or employment, or if you receive other benefits, it's a dance to try to balance not making too much or making enough and losing benefits. And so when that happens, you have to make that crossover. So when your benefits shut off because you're making too much money, there's a transition there. So this coach is able to help people through that transition. So we're trying to increase our enrollment in our classes, of course. And so we had a class this year in September and March, and then we plan to have our next class in August. And so in between the classes, the full month-long classes, we have those virtual classes now, those shorter segments of the course for people that can't take a whole month to do the in-person course. So our next virtual Job Ready Academy is June 27th through July 1st. So if anyone's interested or you know someone that would benefit, then please tell them to call our office. And like I said, it's a regional program, so we've worked with our neighboring localities, and we also help and serve their residents as well. So I think that concludes the information, so I'm open for any questions.
Thanks, Wendy, and thank you to you and your staff for putting this program together. One of the things that came to mind is something else that we heard this morning is all of the families talked about the awareness of what programs are out there and what's current. So how do you contact individuals to get them in this program, and what kind of marketing to make sure that people are aware that they can get into this academy?
Yeah, sure. So our staff work closely with the workers and the social services departments in all of the jurisdictions to get those referrals. So hopefully we're targeting those folks that are receiving benefits and need that assistance. So we have those one-on-one relationships with those workers to get those referrals for families. And then been really happy for Nicole to help us get that word out through social media. So we try to get that out for every course, every class that we have, to get that word out through social media avenues.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So, and maybe you already said this, but what was the partnering opportunity with Chamber of Commerce? Or was that a previous?
Yeah, we developed this program before the pandemic, actually, and started it pretty early with those partners. So, and as a grant, for our grant, we have the neighboring localities support our grant application, which we renew on a yearly basis.
Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. I was with City Manager Trivett and was very impressed by the program, and so I'm glad that you brought it to full council today. So approximately how many people have gone through the academy and life coaching and sort of the track record? over the past few years.
Yeah, it's definitely the pandemic impacted our
Right.
enrollment, and so that's why we're really trying to get the word out and to get more people involved. We typically serve 10 to 15 a month, but then our classes have been lower enrollment, so we've had about 7 recently graduate from the last classes, so we're trying to get that enrollment up. Because once they do enroll and go through the program, we see such great success.
Right, right. And then the majority of them stay with a life coach for how long a time period?
It depends.
Sort of depends on.
It does. So it could be longer if there's more barriers, right? If childcare is a barrier, and but it could be less. Where we had one recent graduate got a job right before the end of the class, and then quickly moved into a management position and
Wow.
and is able to have transportation and get to training through that employer. So didn't need that ongoing support because didn't have some of those other barriers that some other families have.
Thank you. Just another example of innovative programs that the city has developed.
Thank you very much, Ms. Evans, for seeing this program through. It really is a fantastic one, and I'm glad to hear that there is, while there was, it sounds like a dip during the COVID years, still a group, a cohort that come in each year and find employment at the end of it. You've spoken from a life coach side, how we can, as members of the community, benefit to the program, how people who are actually a part of it can benefit. I imagine there's a network of businesses, though, that you all and other localities are in touch with. Could you speak towards the recruitment of businesses that are looking for hardworking employees that could benefit from a program like this, and how you all try to bring them into the fold and let them know there's a pipeline?
Sure, yeah. Our job developer, she's really, her role is also to gather all those job openings, make, relationships with those businesses, and try to do the matchmaking, right? Which employees and try to help people in the direction of the best type of employer that would meet their needs, their skills, and so that is her role primarily, is to kind of build those relationships and do that research on a daily basis, it seems like, and getting that information out to the people that we serve.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, I agree with all the members of council, but that a program like this, providing education and training for folks, helps them with their own self-esteem, gives them some dignity and pride in what they're doing, letting, a sense of accomplishment. And so when they do get in these jobs, they're better prepared to handle them and hopefully get the advancements, as you just mentioned, the one becoming a manager of sorts. So I applaud you and the other members of the region that participate in putting this program together. I think it's an outstanding benefit that we offer residents in need. So congratulations and thank you.
Thank you.
Anything else, Mr. Trivett, with departmental operating reports?
No, sir.
Is there any city manager report?
There is. I wanted to update you all on the progress of the Truth and Reconciliation Committee. As you all know, in July of 2021, the council formed the Truth and Reconciliation Committee out of a desire to understand the impact of racism and racial injustice, both historically and presently, on residents of the city. And we've been progressing through that work diligently in these past months. The committee itself has performed outstandingly well, has really charged into it and developed an excellent work plan. It's been remarkable working with them. And what they told us at the very first meeting was what we were asking of them was an exceptionally tall order, and that was to do this very important work in a period of less than a year even, and have something ready for us by essentially this meeting of the city council. And despite their best efforts and the fact that they did in fact do a lot of work and produce some recommendations, what is clear from those recommendations, and in fact it is one of the recommendations, is that the Truth and Reconciliation Committee be allowed to continue its work so that we can have not just a product but the best product. As essentially this is really about making some significant changes And in order to be certain that those changes are made and serve the city in the best way that they can, I think we need to give this more time. So I have asked the committee to continue to serve for another year, and during that time we will continue to work on the oral histories they're collecting, forums that they plan to host, essentially sharing more information and refining the findings and recommendations that they have to date, so that when we come to City Council, it is something that is both actionable and effective.
Well, thank you for that, and I applaud the efforts of the committee and its chairman, who's in the room today. I won't call him out specifically, but to your point, it was a tall order to assemble a group of people to have the conversation, to listen, and to put all the pieces together to help understand Williamsburg's past. And obviously, we're steeped in history, a lot of good things, a lot of bad things, and this group is doing some good work and interviewing folks and researching some information that may be available. So I'm glad to see that they're going to continue. I think it was been said that working towards true equality is not a sprint, it's a marathon. And so continuing another year, I think, kind of leads to that conversation. And so continuing the work is a positive thing. And Vice Mayor Dent serves ex officio on that, and I'm sure he's got something to add.
Yeah, and obviously Mr. Trivett summed up the work that the committee's done, but I think, and they have done a tremendous amount of work. I think that one thing that summed it up when we were talking about extending the work of this committee was the committee themselves said early on it took them some time to get accustomed to each other and trust each other to open up to each other. So that early on, the first several months of the committee, they worked on that. And obviously they've come together as a team and done a tremendous amount of work, and there's still a lot of work to be done, but I also applaud everyone on the committee because they've met time after time after time after hours to bring those recommendations forward.
Maslin, any comments?
Not on this, just another one after this.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Drew.
Only a note of appreciation to the chairman and all members of the committee. We look forward to seeing their recommendations as they come.
Anything else from the city manager?
No, sir.
I had a question for either Drew or Michelle. Any updates from Richmond that might affect us? I know it's not all complete, but there may be some good news there.
One update I can share with the governor has not signed the budget yet, but one update related to William and Mary's request for funding for a data hub center has been currently, as it stands, and if the governor signs it, there will be $350,000 this next fiscal year, this upcoming fiscal year, to study that effort with other higher education institutes in the area, namely ODU, Hampton University, and I believe Christopher Newport.
That's right. And also, can you speak to, there is a lot of success in terms of money going, hopefully, to Newport News and NASA. That'll be a big part of that, right?
Yes, sir. There was if signed, there will be $3 million from the state to support the Jefferson Lab expansion, the Federal Department of Energy project that some call our consolation prize, but we were not awarded the project a few years ago. It went to New York, but this would be a supercomputing project that could come here, but needs some state funding to match the federal funds to make that happen.
And then the bill going to the governor regarding the grocery tax is just the state's portion, correct?
That is what we hear, although we've not seen details.
Okay. Thank you.
Hopefully by our July meeting, we will have the final developments from the budget.
Ms. Shelton?
Nothing today.
All right, any unfinished business?
No, sir.
On new business, we have first consideration and approval of resolution number 22-14, enacting the City of Williamsburg's operating general fund balance policy. Cameron.
So Resolution 22-14 proposes updating or an update to our fund balance policy. Now, in the agenda item, it includes several reasons of why we have these policies and why they're important. I'm not going to go through every one because it's readily available, but certainly it helps us look at long-term planning, and it helps us when it comes time to make decisions in regards to our revenues, our expenditures. But really what this is doing is keeping our 35% fund balance policy. We're not changing that. We are proposing a 5% operating or budget stabilization fund for the operating fund. One important part of that is, and I had someone tell me once, you can't plan those revenues and expenditures close enough to always know you're going to hit that 35%. So you want a little cushion in there to help maintain that. The rating agencies do tend to look at not only what our policy is and are we following our policy, they also tend to look at whether or not you're pulling it down or whether you're drawing from it below the policy, and also what you're drawing it for. So if you're drawing for something for reoccurring expenditure, that's probably more concerning than if you're using some excess fund balance for one-time expenditures, or depending on the circumstances. I think we just seen going through COVID. Also, the state does a physical distress report every year, and they've changed recently how they do that, and they've started assigning points. And I was noticing going through the most recent report that they assign points if you pulled from your fund balance. And then I don't know that they really looked at whether you had excess fund balance or not. And so we did get some points for that. Now, at least they did it in ranges, and we're on the lower end of that range because we didn't draw a lot. But certainly having that budget stabilization is a good thing to do, and it serves many good purposes. But mainly why I wanted to bring it back before the end of this year is because of the additional funds that we have coming through from ARPA, and I wanted to clarify that we would make this of operating revenues, excluding any substantial one-time revenue sources. And then the other thing that we did is we expanded on the requirements for replenishing the unassigned fund balance once we use it. So we would need to come back with a plan to replenish that. And hopefully if the cause of pulling from that fund balance had to do with an unstructural unbalance in our finances, that we'd also have come back with a strategy of how we're going to address that. So with that, I'll open it up for any questions you might have regarding the policy.
But just for clarity, really what we're doing here is codifying the policy that we've already implemented in the 35%.
Right.
That's just creating that policy. But then in addition, this is creating a 5% general fund
budget stabilization.
Gotcha. And would that be held separately when you look at our reports?
Yes, it would be.
Any other?
So yeah, I had a question on the 5%. I support the 35%. It's, as the mayor stated, it's what we're already doing, and and I appreciate the clarification on not those unanticipated funds, things such as ARPA, one-time revenues. So the 5% would be funded as a part of the proposed budget?
Right, and I think we would use, and I'll ask Mr. Trivett to correct me if he has a different opinion, but I think we would look at using some portion of the surplus to build that up until we can establish that moving forward. And then again, I think also that serves that and I think you've heard Mr. Truitt and I both say that you want a little cushion in that 35%, particularly having just come through COVID. I think we can see why that's important. But I think we would look to fund it with some of our surpluses.
Yeah, absolutely. So this policy really is just codifying our existing practices. So Ms. Dameron and I both would prefer, and the word that's used in the policy says the target. We target 40%. And the reason is because we want to limit the chances of having to dip into that 35% unnecessarily. And that's important because well, even this last year, the Commission on Local Government produced their financial assessment for fiscal health for the localities across the state. And we slipped a little bit in our ratings because during COVID, we used some of our reserve below the 35% number. And even though it's still a very healthy reserve, that's a penalty marker. And while that's not a rating agency, that definitely indicates that that's a factor that rating agencies will consider. And so that 5% cushion just gives us that ability to maneuver a little bit without getting close to the threshold, except in extreme circumstances. Ms. Dameron's right. It's not something that, as we do our budget process, she says, oh, we're going to be less than 40%, and that triggers me to say, well, we're going to have to raise taxes. That's not the intent. The intent is by targeting 40%, we stay in a very healthy range above the 35.
Well, and I recall when I was an employee that you talked about targeting the 40%. So this just separates it out to say 35 and a 5% stabilization. So do you have what that rough figure or what that 5% would be?
Oh, off the top of my head, I would say for us, it's probably going to be around maybe 5 million.
35% is about 14 million, right?
Right, but we finished last year, and the reason I'm going with that is we finished about 39.8% last year, and I'm probably wrong on that too.
We were really close to.
Yeah.
Let me give you another reason why this is an important practice. It's because one of the reasons that we are finishing COVID very strong fiscally is because in the middle of COVID, Barbara and I did our best to prioritize the reserve and keep it healthy. So everywhere that we could, we diverted funding to the reserve to build it up last year, knowing that this year was the year that we intended to have to really draw from it. Fortunately, revenues have performed such that that's likely not the case. And so that's a reason for building it up and trying to stay in that 40% range.
And I would still stay probably around, maybe 5 might be a little high, but I still think it's going to be around 4, somewhere in there.
Got to be high, because I mean, if maintaining about $14 million, $15 million is 35% of our operating budget, how can 5% be 5 million?
Well, that's at 30%, right? So
Is it 5 million just
So
because
five-
this year's operating is 117 million for this fiscal year?
I'm sorry.
5 million, 500,000.
It's 3.1
For
million,
this.
Mayor. In a typical year, it's 3.1 million.
Okay.
That makes
So I'm a
being an
little on the
atypical
high
year.
side there,
Yeah.
but
Thank you. Mr. Maslin?
Yeah, I have some comments. So it really would have been helpful if this was discussed during the work session, where we could actually have, more discussion about both the policy and the wording before it was sort of put out to the public without any of the city council fingerprints on the wording. Also, that would have given us an opportunity to review this proposed policy with figures. So we would actually have them in front of us and see, well, if we had this policy, say, 3 years ago for each of those successive years, what would it have meant? And I know we all agree on the need to periodically review our financial policies. Since the budget message this year offered insight from Benjamin Franklin, I was looking for another quote. And I like this one. It says, he said, if you know how to spend less than you get, you have the philosopher's stone. So if you know how to spend less than you get, you have the philosopher's stone, and maybe next month we can talk about what that stone is. If it does make sense, as we've talked about, to not inflate the 35% reserve calculation with one-time revenues. But what about, and it may be a moot point now, but what about revenues where the city is merely a conduit for state or federal funds? So we saw that with the school system. So the state sends us state funds for the school district. We just pass them along. In the previous years, was that part of the 35% calculation?
Yes, it was.
Now that's been resolved.
We're not doing that.
That's been resolved. But do we have any other examples of that where we're just a conduit for state funds or federal funds?
There are plenty of examples that we're a conduit for tax revenues we receive. Most of them are school-related, though. An argument for including that in the calculation is that very often when there are shortfalls, the school will look to us to make up the difference anyway. And so being prepared to do that is important. But
looking at the proposed 5% budget stabilization fund, as a rainy day fund, and we can build it up during times of prosperity and draw it down during a recession, correct? I think council would benefit from taking time to review what staff has written, especially for the fifth dot point there, under use and replenishment of general fund unassigned fund balance, which says the strategy development should consider any unintended consequences. Examples to consider are necessary reductions in service levels due to reduced expenditures, increased cost of delaying capital improvements, the potential safety and risk factors, the impact on customer service, employee morale, or other costs associated with staff reductions. For example, the strategy, in addition to that, the strategy could also include identifying needs versus wants within the capital improvement plan, and then prioritizing them. By right-sizing the capital plan, we would be able to minimize the need for any staff reductions during a recession. This draft policy would also benefit from including a statement recognizing the importance of the community's economic health, and state that raising taxes should be a last resort. What I'm concerned about is having future city councils being thrown this in their face and being said, hey, you have to raise taxes because of this. So, for example, last year when we were told we needed to raise the tax rate on real estate by 8 cents, and we said no, we agreed at 4 cents, but we were still being told, well, the next year you're going to have to raise it again. And what we saw was we were able to cut it. And so that's my concern in terms of this wording not having any benefit of input from city council.
Well,
Barbara, let me say this. I take exception to the language that we would throw a policy in the council's face. That's not something that this staff would ever do. We consider ourselves to be a team with the city council, and we would work toward a resolution that we both thought was wise. The language in that fifth bullet is really to sort of do the opposite of what I think you think it means. What it's saying is we're not going to sacrifice those things to achieve the 35% balance. The decision to raise taxes, like this policy, are wholly the decision of the city council. And so the city council at any time can decide to violate its own policy for good reason, as we have done in the last 2 years, but also to revise this policy or delete it if the council felt like they needed to. This policy is based on best practices from localities all over the country, including in Virginia, in terms of stating particularly what we would do if we drop below the 35%. That's its only intent. But if the council feels like we need to pull this back and bring it to a work session to talk about it more fully, we're happy to do that. That wasn't our intention to rush this through. I would say that if we look back at the last 3 years and how this policy would affect our operation, it wouldn't, because this has been our practice for the last 3 years. In fact, longer than that. All we were trying to do was to codify the things that we're already doing so that they're in the budget as a policy. That's all.
And I was under the impression that we had talked about this last year. It came up then, and we decided to move it forward a little bit because of COVID and some of the situations that were occurring then. So,
right. This was one of the slated policies last year. We pulled it off the agenda because we knew we were going to have to use the reserve and violate the policy right out of the gate. And we didn't think it was wise to adopt the policy and then have to explain why we were immediately violating it.
And the 35% reserve policy has been in effect for a long time. This was developed, I think, by City Manager Tuttle, is that correct? And has served the city well over that time period. So one question I had, so just talking about the 5%, so like when we would hit 39% for the reserve, would you then just sort of take off 4% of that and put it into this 5% stabilization fund? Or as we exceed it, had a surplus, you put a little in? Or?
So part of what I envision is if we have the 35% plus the 5, and the 5 would be in the stabilization, and that would help when we use it of not violating a policy, or in the case of how the state currently is looking at it, we'd be pulling, which would be the purpose of that fund when we needed it, but we keep the 35% intact and we would keep them separate. So when we had that 39%, I would see that we would have a portion of that in the budget stabilization.
So if we needed to pull money, it would come from the stabilization fund first, and then we would go to the reserves, sort of keeping it whole.
In fact, the policy states that, and I think that fifth paragraph was just saying that as we made a replenishment plan, we need to take these things into consideration. Not intended to hold anyone hostage, just saying as we're coming forth with a plan, these are some unintended consequences that we need to take into consideration when we're looking to replenish that.
Well, and I think that, you know, like most of us in our personal lives, we sort of categorize money in different areas and don't dip into our 401k. And so I like having these different funds that are sort of corralled.
Well, in a way, before we separated the CIP, that's kind of what we were doing in a different way. We didn't call it a budget stabilization, but in effect what was happening is they kept enough in the general fund to make sure we maintained that 35%, and anything else went over to the CIP. And that was part of the reason for wanting to separate it, so that we could see what portion that the general fund was subsidizing the CIP a little clearer. It wasn't very transparent, and typically you would have a transfer to the general fund for your pay-go capital.
Right, that's what I was just going to say. It's really increased the transparency with, you know, the capital improvement fund, the tourism fund, the different ones like that. Yeah, education, school. So a question for City Manager Trivett. You talked about us getting sort of these demerits. Is there a time period that they go away, like car insurance points?
You know, there's not. In fact, I don't believe there's even a schedule for how often they are going to do the fiscal stress analysis in the state. It's been some years since they did it last, and it was very unfortunate, probably for all localities, that they chose to do it last year. And, you know, you can look at that report and find all kinds of reasons that the outcomes are not perfect. And a good example is, in our case, there's no consideration of how much is in the reserve when they decide. All they did was say, well, you used the reserve, and therefore you get this score, which is lower than you would have if you hadn't. And then there's not a follow-up question that balances that out to account for how much the reserve is in the locality. And so I don't mean to make a cautionary note, other than to say it is something that these agencies look at when they're looking at fiscal health and fiscal stress.
So they didn't put a little asterisk, COVID years or something when they did that. And to your point, I would think a lot of municipalities dipped into their reserves and went below their policy levels during COVID.
Many did, and you know, it's just, when you look at that report, it's sort of jumps out at you because it's the only category where we had a negative score.
So, thank you.
Thank you for the report, Director Dameron. I'd first say I'm surprised to hear that when it sounds like there was no consideration as to the percentage of operating budget for localities that have dipped into it.
Right.
I really have no questions. I'm in favor of the 5% stabilization fund. Back when we heard from Davenport and Company, I think in April or so was it, I asked, with the potential of us to dip into the reserves, is there a chance that we would jeopardize our AA1 and AAA rating from the ratings agencies? Their answer was kind of no, but, and it's no because we still have a very healthy near 35% reserves. We are much lower than the 10% rate at borrowing versus total physical assets in the city. But their caution was, if it's a trend, it could jeopardize that high rating that the city is very proud of. So stabilization fund, as it's been described, as it's obviously not something to dip into for capital expenditures you might want to do in a year, but instead only on the offhand chance that you have to go into the reserves, and not wanting to do so, having this 5% buffer makes total sense.
Yeah, so, cushion buffer, it provides that elasticity to protect us from dipping into the 35% and being dinged. And I think, in good times, to be able to support that extra 5% is a good thing. And as we may see, and we will see, tougher economic times in the future, to be able to ratchet into that 5% to stave off maybe a tax increase would be a tool that a future council may have. I think that's invaluable. So I would conclude that if we are able to fund it with this policy and money is available, we should do it.
So I think the practical application is that, and this has been true since I've been the city manager, in most years we won't have 40%. We won't have that 5% fully available. We'll have some number less than. The advantage to having that is we don't have to have as much gnashing of teeth and white knuckles about we're going to use a little bit of that. So it essentially acts as a contingency for the overall operation.
Any other questions or comments?
Well, just one last comment. It's one thing that the pandemic has shown us, I think, is to be prepared. And this is just another tool to be prepared for financial crises when they come around, because there will be other ones. So I move that City Council approve Resolution 22-14, adopting the fund balance policy.
Second?
Mr. Rogers?
Aye.
Ms. Ramsey?
Aye.
Mayor Pons?
Aye.
Vice Mayor Dent?
Aye.
Mr. Maslin?
Aye.
Takes us to item B, budget amendment for the fiscal year ending June 30th, 2022. Proposed resolution number 22-15. Ms. Dameron.
Yes, 22-15, we're appropriating in the general fund for some grants that we received. So we received $2,481 in a little grant, $14,806 from the Virginia EMS Scholarship Program for fire training, and then our asset forfeiture funds. In the capital improvement fund, we're appropriating some funds from Holly Hills LLC to construct sidewalks. And then in the utility fund, we're just making an adjustment for the bonuses that were transferred from the general fund that were received earlier, and there was some additional adjustments to that. We needed to appropriate another $9,574.
No questions.
No questions?
Pretty straightforward.
Pretty straightforward. So I move that City Council approve Resolution 22-15 to adjust the General Fund, Capital Projects Fund, and the Utility Fund.
Second.
Mr. Rogers?
Aye.
Ms. Ramsey?
Aye.
Mayor Pons?
Aye.
Vice Mayor Dent?
Aye.
Mr. Maslin?
Aye.
Thank you. Takes us now to item C, an ordinance number 22-04, an ordinance to approve the Colonial Group Home Commission amended agreement and change the name to Colonial Juvenile Service Commission.
So City Council has already seen this and approved this ordinance back in August. James City approved it and York approved it, but Gloucester County, the other member, did not approve it and then subsequently made changes to the agreement, which now necessitates all the jurisdictions to approve it once again. The changes are not substantive. They reworded a few sections and added a code reference. And so this is housekeeping. So staff's recommendation is that you approve ordinance number 22-04.
Any questions or comments?
So I move that City Council adopt ordinance 22-04 to approve the Colonial Group Home Commission amended agreement and change of name to Colonial Juvenile Services Commission.
Second.
Mr. Rogers?
Aye.
Ms. Ramsey?
Aye.
Mayor Pons?
Aye.
Vice Mayor Dent?
Aye.
Mr. Maslin?
Aye.
Okay, takes us now to item D, reappointment of Joyce Allowance to the Thomas Nelson Community College. Mr. Maslin, would you like to do that?
Yes, thank you. I move that City Council reappoint Dr. Joyce Jarrett Elwise to the Thomas Nelson Community College Board of Trustees, which is becoming the Virginia Peninsula Community College Board of Trustees.
Second?
Mr. Rogers?
Aye.
Ms. Ramsey?
Aye.
Mayor Pons?
Aye.
Vice Mayor Dent?
Aye.
Mr. Maslin?
Aye.
Okay, takes us now to a portion of the meeting with open forum, which allows anybody in the audience who'd like to come forward. But it has anything they'd like to address, please do so. Seeing none, I'll close the open forum, and I believe we have a matter for closed session.
If I could quickly interject, I want to speak out of turn. I know that there was a single applicant for another board and commission space. Is that intended to come in front of council in a subsequent meeting?
Yes, because we have the other reappointments to do as well.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Vice Mayor.
I move to go into closed session pursuant to section 2.2-3711 of the Code of Virginia for the purpose of discussing two personnel matters per subparagraph 1 concerning evaluations of the city manager and the city attorney.
Second?
Mr. Rogers?
Aye.
Ms. Ramsey?
Aye.
Mayor Pons?
Aye.
Vice Mayor Dent?
Aye.
Mr. Maslin?
Aye.
Okay, we'll go in closed sessions, and we'll return to adjourn the meeting.